Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute most fascinating historical mysteries and, honestly, theological cover-ups of the last 2 millennia. Based on a comprehensive new research report, we're looking at a document that was excluded from the Bible, but not because it was a fraud. Nope, it was left out because it presented a radically different view of spirituality and power. We're talking about the Gnostic Gospel of Mary Magdalene. All right, let's just jump right in by confronting the image of Mary Magdalene that you probably have in your head right now. For centuries, if you sat through a sermon, you likely heard she was a repentant sinner, a woman weeping at the foot of the cross, and very often a reformed prostitute. But where did that story actually come from? Well, as it turns out, there is a massive, stark contrast between the institutional myth we all grew up with and the actual historical record. Early texts tell us Mary was from Magdala, a pretty prosperous fishing town. She was a woman of means, an independent financier who actually financially supported Jesus and his disciples. And more importantly, she was the very first witness to the resurrection, the foundational apostolic witness. So the whole prostitute story? It was a deliberate smear campaign. Back in 591 CE, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily where he literally conflated Mary Magdalene with 2 other unnamed sinful women in the Bible. There is absolutely no line in any canonical gospel that calls her a prostitute. 1,378 years. That is exactly how long it took for the Catholic Church to quietly retract Pope Gregory's mistake. They finally acknowledged he was wrong in 1969. But, as you can imagine, by then the damage was completely done. Her true identity as a premier spiritual leader, along with the gospel bearing her very name, had been practically wiped from public consciousness.
Okay, let's move into Section 1, Rediscovering the Lost Gospel.
You might be wondering, how on earth did we get her words back after such a thorough, centuries-long institutional erasure? Well, her gospel wasn't found locked away in some grand Vatican vault. Actually, it was purchased from an antique dealer in Cairo back in 1896 by a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt. This text, known as the Berlin Gnostic Codex, proves something really profound. Suppressed texts often survive underground, quietly traded among people who recognize their immense value, totally outside official channels. But here's the absolute tragedy of this rediscovered manuscript. Out of an estimated 18 original pages, we only have 8. 10 pages are just lost. And this isn't just a minor inconvenience either. Those missing pages covered the exact sections detailing Mary's most profound visions and the soul's cosmic journey. Whether they just decayed over time or were deliberately destroyed, the very heart of her gospel is, sadly, mostly gone. Which brings us to Section 2, what Mary actually taught. Despite those missing pages, what does remain of Mary's teachings completely turns traditional dogma on its head, and it starts with a radical redefinition of sin. In her gospel, Jesus explains to the disciples that sin isn't just a list of moral crimes written in a rule book that requires external forgiveness. Instead, sin is a metaphysical condition. It's essentially cosmic adultery, which means getting your divine spirit all tangled up with temporary material attachments and forgetting who you truly are. Mary also explains that she didn't receive her visions of the risen Christ through her physical senses or through dreams or hallucinations. She received them through the nous. The nous is pure intellect, the highest cognitive faculty. This aligns beautifully with Platonic and Hermetic traditions, basically suggesting that direct spiritual knowledge is something accessed from an awakened state right within human consciousness itself. She then maps out this incredibly precise cosmological journey. When the soul ascends, it has to face and deliberately disidentify from 4 binding powers trying to pull it back down into the material world: darkness, desire, ignorance, and wrath. To pass through, the soul has to speak back to each power, declare its divine origin, and boldly refuse their claims. So, you can see here how Mary's cosmic model fundamentally empowers the individual. It's all about finding liberation from the inside out by simply remembering your true divine origin. You don't need a middleman to grant you absolution. And honestly, you can see why this directly threatened the emerging Orthodox Church, right? They were building and maintaining their worldly power on an institutional model of guilt, punishment, and external absolution. And that exact friction brings us to Section 3, the institutional erasure. Let's trace the timeline of exactly why and how this profound document was deliberately removed. Over the centuries, there was a very deliberate consolidation of Orthodox power. The Gospel was composed somewhere between 120 and 180 CE. By 180 CE, figures like Irenaeus were already publicly attacking Gnostic texts. Then in 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea consolidates imperial Christianity. And the final, crushing blow? That came in 367 CE when Bishop Athanasius issued a sweeping ban on all non-canonical texts. These early communities were forced to either destroy their documents or hide them out in the desert, which is exactly where texts like Mary sat waiting until 1896. But we really need to understand that erasing Mary's gospel wasn't just some isolated event. It was part of a much larger systemic campaign to basically remove the divine feminine. In Gnostic traditions, the divine literally included Sophia, or wisdom, a female principle. Early on, women like Junia were named as apostles, and Phoebe was recognized as a deacon and overseer. Women actually held these active leadership and teaching roles in the earliest Christian communities. It was only later, as those institutional hierarchies hardened, that they were systematically relegated and excluded. Let's look closer at how this played out in Section 4, the conflict. What is so incredibly fascinating here is that the Gospel of Mary actually anticipates its own suppression. It captures this deeply human, super tense confrontation right on the page. After Mary shares her profound visions, Peter gets genuinely angry. He just flatly refuses to believe that Jesus would secretly teach a woman, asking, are we supposed to turn around and all listen to her? Notice what's happening. Peter isn't arguing theology. His resistance isn't about the content at all. It's a human, gendered power struggle. He represents the institutional hierarchy, while Mary represents direct, inner spiritual knowledge. And then Levi steps in. This is an absolute mic-drop defense of Mary. Levi looks at Peter and says, if the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? That single sentence perfectly highlights the core conclusion. According to these early texts, the ultimate rejection of female spiritual authority was a conscious, deliberate choice made by men seeking control, not some decree handed down by the divine.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 5, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Seekers.
So, bringing it all together, what should we really take away from this ancient, fragmented text today? Well, the modern relevance is simply staggering. Mary's 2,000-year-old cosmological map of the soul perfectly mirrors some of our most highly advanced modern frameworks. Her focus on the nous ties right into modern consciousness research, dealing with the hard problem, the idea that mind is primary, not just a biological accident. Even wilder, her 4 binding powers map flawlessly onto Carl Jung's depth psychology, like the shadow and destructive complexes. Escaping those powers, that's essentially the modern therapeutic practice of disidentifying from your fears and conditioned beliefs. As millions of people today deconstruct the religious frameworks they grew up with, searching for something deeper, the Gospel of Mary stands as this powerful, perennial beacon. It reminds us that the silenced voices of history often hold the exact keys to the inner awakening we are still searching for. Which leaves us with this final thought. What if the ultimate truth isn't something you join or something managed by an institution? What if, just like Mary taught 2,000 years ago, it is already right there inside you, just waiting to be remembered? Thanks for joining me on this explainer.